It was supposed to be just another slow Tuesday morning at Rosie's diner. The coffee was hot, the bacon was sizzling on the griddle, and the jukebox played an old Elvis tune that barely anyone listened to anymore. Rosie Evans, the 38-year-old owner and head waitress, wiped down the counter with the same rhythm she'd had for the last 10 years. Small-town life didn't change much in Weston, especially not in her diner. Locals drifted in for breakfast like clockwork, truckers passing through knew the place for its pancakes, and Rosie knew every face, every usual order, and every story, or so she thought. That morning, the bell above the diner door jingled, and the mood shifted just slightly, like the air thickened for a beat. In walked a man who didn't fit the usual crowd. Leather vest, faded jeans, tattoos crawling down both arms, and a glare sharp enough to slice through silence. He had a scar that ran down his right cheek like it had a story of its own. Some of the regulars looked up, paused their chewing, and exchanged glances. No one said anything out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing: Hell's Angel. He sat quietly at the far end of the counter, ordered black coffee and a Western omelet, then kept to himself. Rosie didn't flinch. She'd seen all kinds of folks over the years, people broken, people lost, people trying to find a warm place to sit and a kind face to serve them. She figured he was no different. Maybe a long ride behind him, maybe a longer road ahead. Whatever it was, she didn't care about his cut or his club patch. She cared that he said, "please," when he ordered and looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in days. But not everyone shared Rosie's view. About 15 minutes later, the diner's door slammed open again. Two local sheriff's deputies walked in like they were looking for a problem. Rosie recognized them right away: Deputy Barnes and his partner, Willis. Both had been on the force long enough to act like they owned every square foot of town. They barely looked at Rosie before their eyes locked on the biker at the counter. They approached him without hesitation. "Hey, tough guy," Barnes barked, hands already hovering near his belt. "You lost or just looking to start something?" The man didn't move. He just took another sip of coffee and kept his gaze forward. "We don't want trouble here," Willis added, stepping closer. "Especially from your kind." "Your kind." Rosie heard those words like a slap across the room. She dropped the coffee pot she was holding and marched straight over. "That's enough," she said, firmly but without yelling. "He's a paying customer, not a threat." Barnes turned toward her, amused. "Rosie, this ain't your business. We're just making sure everything stays safe." She crossed her arms. "This is my business. This is my diner. And right now, you're bothering a customer who hasn't done a thing wrong." The deputies looked stunned. No one ever challenged them, especially not Rosie Evans, the kind-hearted widow who ran the quiet little diner near the edge of town. But something about the way they cornered that man, it rubbed her wrong. Maybe it was the way they stood over him like he was already guilty. Or maybe it was the look in his eyes, like he'd been through this scene more times than he could count. "You sure you want to stick your neck out for him?" Barnes asked, squinting at her like she was insane. Rosie didn't blink. "He didn't come in here looking for a fight. But you did. Now either order some breakfast or leave." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Barnes muttered something under his breath and motioned to his partner. "Let's go." They left, though not quietly. Doors swung hard behind them, and tires screeched as their cruiser sped off. The moment they were gone, Rosie exhaled and turned to the man still sitting at the counter. He gave her a nod, just a slight one, but in that nod was something that felt heavy, like gratitude packed in iron. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded again. "Been worse." She gave a half-smile and brought him a fresh cup of coffee, on the house. The rest of the day passed slowly. Some folks muttered things as they left, others stayed quiet but watched her differently. By closing time, Rosie was beginning to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Not because she thought the man had done anything wrong, but because she knew how this town worked. Small towns remember everything. And small minds talk louder than open hearts. The man had long since gone, left a 20 on the table and no name. Just a plate scraped clean and a warm spot where he'd sat. Rosie didn't sleep well that night. Too many thoughts in her head. Too much worry about whether the cops would hold a grudge. Whether she'd scared away her regulars. Whether the man she defended even cared. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened the next morning. The sun had barely risen when she pulled into the gravel lot behind the diner. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Then her eyes adjusted, and she realized she wasn't. Motorcycles. Lined up. Dozens. No, hundreds. Chrome, black steel, leather, and engines that growled like thunder waiting to crack the sky. The entire parking lot, the street, even the field across the road, packed. Every single one with the same insignia, the winged death's head of the Hell's Angels. Rosie froze in place, keys dangling in her fingers. A man stepped forward from the crowd. Same face, same scar. He nodded once more. "You showed respect. Now we're showing ours." Before she could speak, before she could understand what this meant, 200 bikers stood in silent formation, facing her diner like it was sacred ground. And that was just the beginning. Rosie didn't move. She just stood there, jaw slightly open, eyes darting from one bike to the next. The low rumble of idling engines filled the air like a heartbeat. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was steady. Controlled. Intentional. The same way soldiers might stand at attention, still, focused, waiting for a command. The man with the scar, the one who'd been in her diner the day before, took a slow step toward her. He wasn't smiling, but his face held something else. Respect. Seriousness. Maybe even a hint of protection. Rosie couldn't find her voice. Not yet. Not when it felt like her little corner of the world had just been dropped into a completely different universe. "You probably got a lot of questions," the man said calmly, his voice carrying just enough over the hum of bikes. "My name's Roach." She blinked. "Roach?" He nodded. "That's what they call me." She let out the smallest laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was all too surreal. "Okay, Roach, why are you here? Why are they here?" Roach looked back at the sea of bikers behind him. "You stood up for someone when you didn't have to. In our world, that means something. A lot, actually." Rosie swallowed hard. "I didn't do it for some reward." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." She glanced around, suddenly aware of how exposed everything felt. Her diner was still locked up. Her phone was in her purse inside. The sun was still barely over the horizon. And her sleepy little town hadn't even begun to wake up yet. But when it did, it would explode. "This doesn't make any sense," she said. "You don't even know me." Roach gave a faint smile this time. "One of the brothers you defended yesterday?" He's my cousin. Been through a lot. PTSD, couple bad breaks, law always watching him like a hawk. But he's got a good heart. You saw that. You looked past the vest, the ink, the attitude. Most people don't. Rosie glanced down, then back up. You all came here for that? He nodded again. We came to show you that we don't forget who stands with us when things get real. Just then, the first pickup truck of the morning rolled past the diner. The driver slowed down, mouth hanging open as he took in the sight. Rosie already knew the gossip would spread like wildfire. By noon, everyone in Weston would know that Rosie Evans had 200 bikers parked outside her place like a scene out of a movie. She took a breath and reached for her keys. You all want breakfast? Roach raised a brow. You serious? She pushed open the door. It's a diner. What else would I do? Within minutes, the smell of coffee and fried eggs filled the air. Rosie worked the grill like muscle memory, but her eyes kept darting to the windows. Some bikers stayed outside, watching the lot. Others lined up, polite and quiet, taking turns coming in to eat. They didn't push. Didn't demand. They treated the place like it was sacred ground. As she poured another cup of coffee, her hand still slightly shaking, a soft voice came from the far corner booth. You always been like that? She turned. It was an older biker, probably in his 60s, with gray in his beard and kindness in his eyes. He wore the same cut as the others, but something about him felt different. More grounded. Like what? She asked. Willing to go toe-to-toe with the badge for a stranger. Rosie thought about it for a second. I don't know. Maybe. I guess I just don't like bullies. He smiled. Then you're braver than most. His name was Slim, and over the next hour, Rosie found herself learning more about these men than she ever thought she would. Many were veterans. Some had served time. Others had run from families or cities that never gave them a shot. But every one of them treated her with a kind of unspoken reverence, as if her one moment of courage had turned her into something more than a diner owner. But the rest of the town didn't see it that way. By 9 a.m., squad cars were circling. Reporters had already begun showing up with cameras and long lenses. Locals stood across the street, watching like it was a zoo. A few even yelled things Rosie couldn't quite make out. Fear. Suspicion. Judgment. All the usual suspects in a town that didn't like being surprised. The sheriff himself, a thick-bellied man named Carson Lowe, pulled up in his SUV and walked straight up to Rosie just outside her door. Rosie, what the hell is going on here? He asked, keeping his voice low but tight. You hosting a gang meeting now? They're not causing trouble, Rosie said. They came for breakfast. Yeah? And you think people around here are okay with this? You're drawing attention we don't want. This could blow up. Rosie met his eyes. They're not the ones causing problems, Sheriff. You want to keep the peace? Maybe start with your own deputies. Sheriff Lowe stared at her for a long beat, like he wasn't used to being challenged. Then he looked over her shoulder at the row of bikes. They staying all day? I don't know, she said honestly. But they're not breaking any laws. He grunted and walked off. But Rosie knew that grunt. It wasn't over. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside to catch her breath. She hadn't stopped moving in hours. Her feet ached, her voice was hoarse, and her heart was somewhere between scared and proud. The sun was now high, glinting off rows of chrome like fire. Roach stood by the edge of the parking lot, arms crossed. She walked up beside him. "This is going to follow me, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," Roach replied without hesitation. "It is." She nodded. "You guys heading out soon?" He looked around, then back at her. "We don't all ride together. Some will peel off. Others will stay a bit. Make sure you're good." "Why?" she asked, still not fully understanding. "Why me?" Roach turned to face her. "Because you reminded us what it feels like to be seen. Not judged. Not feared. Just seen." She didn't know what to say to that. There were no words. But even as the afternoon wore on, Rosie could feel it building, an invisible line forming between her and the rest of Weston. The town she grew up in. The town she had always believed would stand by her. Now, she wasn't so sure. Because sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't make you a hero. Sometimes, it just makes you a target. And Rosie Evans was about to find out how fast a town can turn when you defend the wrong person. The sun was setting, casting long orange streaks across the diner's windows. Rosie leaned against the counter, trying to catch her breath. It had been the busiest day in her life. Plates were piled in the sink, and the smell of bacon, grease, and brewed coffee hung heavy in the air. But it wasn't just the mess or the sore muscles that had her pacing. It was the silence now, too quiet after the storm of the day. Most of the bikers had cleared out, riding off in smaller packs, their engines echoing into the distance like fading thunder. But a handful stayed behind. Roach, Slim, and a few others sat quietly, talking in hushed tones at the corner booth, like they were waiting for something. Rosie kept glancing out the window. More reporters had shown up near the end of the day. Some tried to come inside. She'd refused. Others just stood out by their vans, whispering into cameras with her name on their tongues. "Rosie Evans," they said. "The waitress who defended a Hell's Angel." Some called her brave. Others called her reckless. One even said dangerously sympathetic to outlaw bikers. The headlines were already being shaped, but none of them knew the real story. Not yet. She poured herself a cup of tea and walked outside. The street was quiet now, but she noticed a white sedan across from the diner, windows tinted too dark for a small town. It hadn't moved in hours. Rosie watched it for a moment, then turned her back, pretending she didn't notice. But her nerves stayed alert. Inside, Slim was telling a story about the early days of his riding club, before patches, before the politics. Roach was listening, but not really. He kept watching Rosie, like he was measuring her reaction to every new shift in the wind. "You expecting trouble?" Rosie finally asked, leaning over to him. Roach nodded slowly. "Maybe not tonight. But it's coming." "What kind?" "The kind where people stop pretending they're curious and start trying to punish you for not picking their side." Rosie didn't respond. She just looked down at her hands. She wasn't scared, not in the way most people would be. But she was exhausted. And she could feel something creeping closer. Something colder than fear. Isolation. The next morning, everything changed. She opened the diner like always, but the regulars didn't come in. Not one. The old couple who usually sat by the window? Gone. The sheriff's niece who worked nearby and used to swing by for muffins? Nowhere to be found. Even the mailman skipped his usual chat. The entire town had gone quiet, but not in a peaceful way. In a pointed way. Deliberate. The message was clear: Rosie had crossed a line. Then came the flyers. She found the first one taped to her front door. Then another on the back wall. Then one shoved through the mail slot. Each printed with bold, red letters: support criminals, lose the community. Below that, someone had scrawled in pen, traitor. She ripped them down, but more came later. Each time, a little more threatening. Roach was right. It wasn't over. That night, the lights flickered. Then they went out completely. Rosie called the power company, and they said nothing was wrong on their end. Roach showed up within minutes, flashlight in hand. "You're being watched," he said, no hesitation. "I figured," Rosie replied, forcing a smile. Slim came back that night too, carrying a toolkit and a few solar-powered lanterns. He didn't say much. Just got to work fixing up the breaker box and replacing a few busted security cameras Rosie hadn't even realized were damaged. She realized then how deep things had gone. Someone wasn't just mad, they wanted to send a warning. But the diner wasn't the only place feeling pressure. Roach took a call late one night while Rosie was wiping down tables. She could only hear bits and pieces, but it was clear someone from his club had been cornered outside of town. Badly. 3 guys. Baseball bats. No license plates. No arrests. Just bruises and silence. "They're trying to provoke something," Roach muttered when he hung up. "Who?" Rosie asked. "Cops?" "Could be," he said. "Could be some wannabe vigilantes trying to scare you back into line. Will you fight back?" He looked at her. "Not if we don't have to. But if it comes to it, we protect our own." And just like that, Rosie realized something important. She wasn't just the woman who stood up for a biker. She was now tied to a deeper story, one that involved old grudges, silent codes, and invisible lines this town had drawn long ago. And crossing those lines meant more than angry looks. It meant war, even if it wasn't declared out loud. Meanwhile, another subplot began to take shape. At the edge of town, a new development was being pushed through by a real estate group from out of state. Rosie hadn't paid much attention before, but now she was hearing things, whispers from customers who dared to return. The land across the diner was part of a rezoning project. If the diner went under, if her reputation took just enough damage, someone could scoop it up for cheap. Turn it into a parking lot or a franchise. One of the men pushing the deal. Deputy Willis's brother-in-law. It was starting to make sense now. Maybe the biker incident wasn't just about law and order. Maybe Rosie's stand had made her a threat in more ways than one. She didn't tell Roach everything, not yet. But she began to keep notes. Names. Dates. Suspicious visitors. She wasn't just trying to survive this anymore. She was trying to understand it. And through all of it, Roach stayed close. Sometimes he came for coffee. Sometimes just to sit outside and keep watch. He rarely talked about his past, but Rosie picked up bits and pieces. A sister he hadn't seen in years. A betrayal that split his chapter in two. A promise to his cousin, the quiet man she'd served that first morning, that if anything ever happened to him, Roach would stand by anyone who stood by him. Rosie wondered how long this standoff would last. How long she could go without breaking. Because it wasn't just about bikers anymore. It was about power. About control. About who got to decide who belonged and who didn't. And in a town like Weston, sometimes the greatest danger wasn't a man in leather. It was the smile behind a badge. It started with a rock through the window. Rosie had just finished closing up the diner for the night. The place had been quiet, too quiet. No customers, no calls, not even Roach today. Just her and the dull hum of the fridge. She was wiping the last table when the crash came. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the floor like shrapnel. She ducked behind the counter, heart pounding, breath caught in her throat. Silence. She peeked over. A rock the size of a grapefruit lay in the middle of the room, wrapped in a scrap of paper, tied with rubber bands. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Get out before it gets worse. No name. No mark. Just that. She turned off all the lights, locked herself in the kitchen, and called Roach. No answer. Then Slim. Straight to voicemail. Her stomach turned. Something was wrong. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, the diner was surrounded again. But this time, not with bikers. Squad cars lined the street. Not just Sheriff Lowe, state police too. They walked around her property, inspecting, taking notes. Rosie watched from the kitchen window, hidden behind the curtain. Then she saw Deputy Willis step out of his cruiser. He looked different now. No longer smug. Focused. Like a man playing the long game. A knock came at the back door. Roach. She let him in fast, relief washing over her so hard her knees almost gave out. You didn't answer last night, she said. I was dealing with something, he said, jaw tight. We got hit. Her breath caught. What do you mean, hit? One of our guys, Dom, house fire. They say electrical, but we know better. Is he? He made it out, Roach said. But just barely. She looked at the rock again. They're escalating. Roach nodded. Yeah. And not just here. They're poking at us all over. Hoping we'll lose it. Hoping we'll lash out. Why not fight back? Because that's what they want, he said. They're waiting for a reason to shut us down for good. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to look outside. Those aren't just regular cops out there, he muttered. That's state-level heat. Someone pulled strings. Rosie frowned. Could it be about the land? That development? Roach turned to her, face unreadable. Maybe. Or maybe someone higher up just doesn't like the idea of a woman with a backbone and a diner full of loyalty. That afternoon, the pressure tightened even more. A fire inspector showed up out of nowhere, demanding to see Rosie's permits. Then the health department. Then the zoning board. One after the other. All within hours. She knew this wasn't coincidence. It was a strategy. Wear her down. Make her feel like giving up would be easier than fighting. But Rosie didn't back down. Roach brought in 2 more club members to help her rebuild the broken window. Slim rewired the cameras and added 2 more. They worked quietly, like men used to battle. No talk, just action. They didn't ask what she planned to do next. They just stayed close. Loyal. But the town? The town was unraveling. Rumors spread faster than fire. Rosie heard it all, on the radio, in the whispers outside the gas station. She's part of them now. She's protecting criminals. She's putting the whole town in danger. Then came the message that changed everything. A kid named Miles. 17. Worked part-time at the diner. Sweet, quiet, lived with his grandma. He showed up late one evening, shaking, holding his phone like it was on fire. "They came to my house," he said, voice breaking. "3 men. Asked questions about you. About Roach. Said if I didn't stop working here, something bad might happen." Rosie sat him down, tried to stay calm. But her hands were ice cold. "They threaten your grandma?" she asked. Miles nodded. They knew her name. Her address. Even the meds she takes. Roach's face went dark. Not angry. Just cold. Too cold. "That's it," he muttered. "They're crossing lines now. Innocence off limits. That was always the rule." Slim stood from the corner, his eyes sharp. "That rule's broken." Rosie felt something shift in the air. This wasn't just tension anymore. It was a fuse, lit and burning. Later that night, Rosie walked outside, just needing air. The street was empty. Too empty. The lights flickered again overhead, like something in the wires knew what was coming. She heard the sound of engines far off. Not bikes. Cars. Heavy ones. Moving fast. She turned the corner and saw them. Black SUVs. 3 of them. Pulling up slowly, silently. Their windows too dark. Their presence too deliberate. She didn't recognize them, and that alone made her step back. Roach was already outside before she could call his name. Slim followed. The 2 men walked forward like they'd done this before, shoulders squared, back straight, ready. The SUVs stopped. Doors opened. But no one got out. Not yet. The silence stretched long. Rosie could feel her heartbeat in her ears. Miles stood behind her, pale, staring at the vehicles like they were ghosts. Finally, one man stepped out. A clean-cut man in a dark suit. Not a cop. Not a biker. Something else. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Evans," he said smoothly, "we've been trying to reach you." Roach stepped between them. "She's not interested." The man raised an eyebrow. "This doesn't concern you." Roach didn't move. "Everything concerns me now." The suited man gave a small nod. "So be it." And then, without another word, he got back in the SUV. The vehicles didn't drive off right away. They just sat there, engines humming like a warning. Rosie backed up slowly, eyes locked on the dark windows, mind racing. Who were these people? What did they want? And why did she feel like the real battle hadn't even started yet? The fuse was almost at the end now. The diner was no longer just a business. It was a symbol. And someone out there wanted that symbol destroyed. But Rosie Evans wasn't done. Not yet. The black SUVs didn't move for nearly an hour. They just idled outside Rosie's diner, humming low, like wolves waiting for the lights to go out. Roach and Slim stayed by the door, arms folded, eyes never blinking. Miles sat inside, too scared to go home. Rosie kept watching the man in the suit, wondering why he came, why he knew her name, and why his smile felt more dangerous than any biker she'd ever met. Then, just as suddenly as they arrived, they rolled off, quiet, clean, no tire marks, no threats. Just gone. Rosie thought maybe that was the worst of it. She was wrong. 2 days later, the diner was hit again. Not with rocks. Not with flyers. But with paperwork. A city notice nailed to her front door said she was under investigation for knowingly harboring members of a criminal organization. No trial. No warning. Just a threat of shutdown. Beneath it, stapled messily, was a complaint, filed by someone she'd once considered a friend. The mayor's wife. Rosie held the papers with numb fingers. The community she'd fed for years was now turning legal claws on her. And just when she thought she had no more breath left to fight, another twist hit like a sucker punch. Roach disappeared. Vanished overnight. No calls. No messages. His bike, always parked out back, was gone. Slim said he hadn't heard from him either. The others checked hospitals, back roads, even the bar outside of town where they sometimes met quietly. Nothing. He was just gone. Rosie didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every car that passed, made her stomach turn. It wasn't like Roach to just leave. Not without a word. Not now, when things were this bad. It didn't feel like running. It felt like something else. By morning, Slim returned with something that nearly made Rosie collapse. A package. No return address. Inside, a burner phone. A photo. And a single line scribbled on a napkin. They took him. The photo showed Roach tied to a chair, blood on his face, but his eyes steady. Still unbroken. Rosie dropped to her knees. Her worst fear wasn't just confirmed, it was worse than she imagined. Someone had taken him, and they were sending a message. Not just to her. To all of them. Slim paced the diner, jaw tight. They're not cops. They're not even government, I don't think. There's something else. Rosie stared at the photo, her hands trembling. Why him? Why now? Because he matters to you, Slim said quietly. And you matter to him. The truth hit her like a train. Somewhere along the way, this hadn't just been about standing up for a stranger. It had become something deeper. She'd let someone into her world, and now he was gone. Taken because of her. That night, she called every reporter who'd knocked on her door over the last few weeks. Most had moved on. One picked up. His name was Dev, young, hungry, always chasing the big story. Rosie met him once when he tried to film outside the diner. She'd sent him away then. Now, she gave him everything. I need you to look into this man, she said, sending him the photo of the suit from the SUVs. Find out who he is. Where he's from. Anything. Dev was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You sure you want this?" "No," Rosie said. "But I don't have a choice anymore." Within 24 hours, Dev called back. "I found him," he said. "His name's Vaughn Ellis. Ex-military contractor. Now private security. Works for a firm that's been involved in a bunch of hush-hush real estate takeovers. Your diner? It's sitting on a land deal worth over $10 million. That rezoning push you mentioned? It's part of a much bigger project. They need your land to complete it. Rosie's breath caught. They're trying to force me out. They're not trying, Dev said grimly. They're executing. It all clicked into place. The cops, the flyers, the inspections, the threats, it was all part of a machine. Rosie wasn't just defending Roach anymore. She was standing in the way of a massive operation. And now, they'd taken the one person who might have scared them. Slim stood by the window, watching the street. They're expecting you to cave, he said. To walk away. Sell. Disappear. I'm not walking, Rosie said. Her voice was soft but full of steel. I'm going to get him back. But how? Slim asked. You don't even know where they took him. Rosie turned to the burner phone. It had one saved number. No label. Just digits. And a timer ticking down. Less than 24 hours. She pressed the screen. A voice answered instantly. You shouldn't have called. Rosie's hand shook. Where is he? You're in over your head, Ms. Evans. I don't care. Where is he? You want him back? Walk away. Sign over the diner. Quietly. No drama. You do that, he lives. And if I don't? The voice paused. Then the next photo we send won't be one you can show anyone. The call cut off. Rosie stood still. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. Her heart thundered in her chest, not from fear, but from resolve. Slim picked up the phone, looked at her, and said, Then I guess we're going to war. Rosie didn't speak. She just turned off the lights and stepped outside. The air was cold. The street was still. But something had shifted. She wasn't just defending her diner anymore. She was standing up to something much darker. They had her friend. They had the land. They had the power. But what they didn't have was Rosie Evans ready to fight. The next morning, Rosie walked into the diner like it was any other day. Hair tied back. Apron on. Coffee brewing. But inside, she was steel. The clock on the burner phone had 5 hours left. That's how long she had to make a decision. Give them what they wanted, or lose Roach forever. But Rosie hadn't spent the night planning how to surrender. She'd spent it planning how to fight. Slim had called in the rest of the club, quietly, carefully. Not just the locals, but the ones from 2 states over. No colors, no noise. Just presence. By dawn, the hills outside town were full of bikes. Dozens of them. Engines off. Waiting. Inside the diner, Rosie opened her laptop. Dev, the reporter, had come through again. A contact of his had hacked into a security grid used by Vaughn's firm. Deep in those files was a location, an off-the-books compound just 30 miles out. Unmarked. Remote. Guarded. Roach is there, Dev said over the line. I'd bet my press badge on it. She closed the laptop. It was time. Rosie stepped out onto the porch. Slim stood beside her. And behind them, lined up in rows like ghosts rising from the past, were more than 100 bikers. Silent. Waiting. Some old. Some young. All wearing plain clothes, but carrying a look that said one thing: family doesn't get left behind. She didn't say much. Just 4 words. We ride at noon. The ride out was quiet. A low rumble stretched down the highway, bikes moving in formation. The wind carried dust and the smell of oil and grit. Rosie rode behind Slim, helmet tight, jaw clenched. She had no training. No weapons. Just a plan. And the people willing to back it. They reached the gate just as the sun reached its peak. The compound was tucked between hills, fenced and cold. 2 black SUVs were parked outside, engines idling. Armed guards stood near the entrance, caught completely off guard as the bikes rolled up and surrounded the area in seconds. Vaughn stepped out. His face twitched when he saw Rosie at the front. "You should have walked away," he said, voice low. "You should have picked a softer target," she shot back. Behind her, engines revved. "I don't want blood," she added. "Just Roach. You let him go, we all disappear." Vaughn smiled. "You think that's how this works? You're one woman with a diner. I've buried people for less." Rosie stepped forward. "Then bury me. But before you do, take a good look behind me. You think 100 men drove hours for pancakes?" Vaughn's jaw tightened. He signaled to one of his men. The guard turned and walked back into the building. Tension thickened. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the door creaked open. Roach stumbled out. Bloody. Limping. But alive. The bikers didn't cheer. They didn't move. Just watched as he crossed the dirt lot, reached Rosie, and took her hand. "You really came," he whispered. "Didn't give me much choice," she whispered back. Vaughn stepped forward again, face darkening. "This isn't over." "No," Rosie said. "It's not." Then she nodded at Dev, who stood quietly in the distance, holding up his phone. "We've been recording since we got here. Everything you said. Everything you did. That compound? It's now evidence. And that's not all. Your company. Your ties to the city council. All of it's going public in an hour." Vaughn went pale. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said. "And I'm done being scared of you." There was a long pause. Then Vaughn turned, signaled to his men, and stormed back into the compound. Rosie and Roach didn't wait. They got on the bike and rode. The others followed. By the time they made it back to the diner, Rosie was exhausted, but alive. Roach leaned against the doorway, battered but breathing. Slim cracked open a soda and passed it to him. And just when it felt like maybe the war was over, one last twist came. A single envelope sat on the diner counter. No stamp. No label. Just a note inside. "Nice play. You won the hand. But the table's still ours. Keep looking over your shoulder, Miss Evans. We don't fold." No signature. Just a small poker chip, painted black. Rosie stared at it for a long time. Roach took it from her hand, turned it over, and said, "You just made enemies higher than City Hall." She nodded. "Then I'll cook breakfast for every last one of them." Outside, the engines of the bikers faded down the road. The sun dipped low. And Rosie, once just a diner owner, now stood at the center of something much bigger than she'd ever imagined. But her feet were still planted. Her hands still steady. Because she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the first chapter. The diner opened the next morning like nothing had happened. The sun filtered in through the blinds just the same. The bell above the door still gave its soft chime. But something had shifted inside those walls. Rosie wasn't just a cook or a business owner anymore. She was something else, something harder to define. A protector. A fighter. A name that would now pass quietly from mouth to mouth in certain circles, always with a nod of respect. Roach sat at the corner booth, sipping black coffee. His bruises were fading, but not fast. Every time he lifted the cup, Rosie noticed the small wince in his shoulder. She never said anything. Just brought out his eggs the way he liked them, no onions, extra cheese. He gave her a small, grateful smile every time. The poker chip still sat behind the register. Rosie hadn't thrown it out. She didn't need to. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a reminder. A silent one. That even small towns can stir storms. That even small women can make giants bleed. Dev, the reporter, kept his promise. His story dropped 2 days after the standoff. The footage, the photos, the company connections, all of it was laid bare. Vaughn's firm was hit with 3 separate investigations. By week's end, the city council rezoning project was shelved. Quietly. Without fanfare. No one wanted to answer questions about it anymore. Rosie didn't celebrate. She didn't post anything or go on the news, even when they asked. She just kept working. The counter got busier. Strangers drove in from other towns just to meet her. Most of them didn't say much. Just shook her hand, ordered a meal, and left generous tips. Some wore patches on their jackets. Some wore none at all. But they all came with respect. Slim stayed a little longer than usual. Said he wanted to keep an eye on things, but Rosie knew better. He didn't want to leave her side. Not yet. He even helped fix the broken fence behind the diner and got the coffee machine working again after it had started sputtering. When Rosie told him she could manage, he just smiled and said, "You saved one of ours. We don't forget that." Roach didn't talk much about what happened during the days he was missing. Rosie never pushed. But one night, when the diner was closed and the world was quiet, he finally spoke. "They wanted me to lie," he said, voice soft in the dark. "To say I was paid to show up here. That you hired me to create chaos. That the whole thing was staged so you could sue the city." Rosie turned to him. "And you didn't?" "I told them they were idiots," he said. "I told them you were the first person who ever stood up for me without asking for anything back." She didn't reply. Just let that sit between them. He added, "They would have let me go if I'd turned on you. But I couldn't. Not after the way you looked those cops in the eye for me that first day." Rosie nodded. "Some things are worth more than safety." He looked at her and said, "You're one of those things." Time passed. The threat faded, at least on the surface. Vaughn's name dropped out of the headlines. No one could prove exactly who left that poker chip on the counter. The investigation stalled, tangled in legal tape. Rosie knew it wasn't truly over. It never really would be. But the worst of the storm had passed. For now. She started writing a journal. Nothing fancy. Just a few lines every night. About the customers. About the weird dreams she had. About the biker who once crashed into her life and never really left. Some days, she wrote about fear. Other days, about courage. And sometimes, about the space in between where most of us live. One afternoon, a teenage girl wandered into the diner. Nervous. Clutching a notebook. She sat at the counter and asked for a soda. Rosie brought it with a smile and asked if she was waiting on someone. The girl shook her head. I just wanted to see it. The place where it all happened. Rosie paused. You mean the story? She nodded. My brother, he's in trouble. Not with the law, just bad people. I didn't know where else to go. Rosie didn't ask for details. She just poured another soda, slid it across the counter, and said, start from the beginning. Because that's what she did now. People came. With stories. With pain. With questions. And Rosie listened. Sometimes she offered advice. Sometimes just a hot meal. But she never turned anyone away. Not after everything. Roach helped where he could. He never fully healed from what they did to him, but he didn't let that stop him. He taught a few of the local teens how to fix up old bikes. Some afternoons, Rosie would hear laughter from the garage behind the diner, something she hadn't heard in years. Slim eventually rode on, but he checked in every few weeks. And when Rosie needed something, supplies, help, a message passed through a network she barely understood, he made sure it got done. Quietly. No questions. And the diner? It stayed open. Through city pushback, through quiet threats, through anonymous complaints. Rosie handled them all the same way, with patience, with fire, with love. The sign out front still read Evan's Diner, but everyone in town had started calling it something else. The last stop. Because for some, it was the last safe place. The last place someone told them they mattered. The last place someone stood up and said, enough. Rosie never asked for the spotlight. She never wanted to be a symbol or a fighter or the woman who took on the system. But life doesn't ask what you want. Sometimes it just hands you a match and waits to see what you'll light. In the end, she lit more than a fire. She lit a path. So when the next black SUV rolled slowly past the diner one rainy night and paused for just a little too long, Rosie didn't flinch. She didn't call anyone or duck behind the counter. She just stepped out onto the porch, looked straight through the tinted glass, and nodded once. The SUV drove on. Because they knew. And she knew. The fight wasn't over. But neither was she.